Okay, welcome and good evening all. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this next event as part of the series put on by the Collaborative for Better Health and Regulation. The Collaborative, it reflects a shared ambition by the Melbourne Law School, the Melbourne Medical School and the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health to ensure that regulation serves the needs of society and constructively enables activity to improve population health and healthcare. The Collaborative has as its central ambition enabling better health through regulation. I am Professor Mark Taylor. I'm one of the directors of the Collaborative, and on behalf of myself and the other directors, Professors Megan Munsey and Marie Bismarck, I welcome you to this event and I thank you for joining us this evening. The Collaborative always provides us with an opportunity to come together across disciplines, different areas to explore and understand how together we might work together to make things better. And the issue we're going to be considering tonight is a very good example of an area where we need a coordinated, multidisciplinary approach and more than anything, genuine partnership with patients and their families. If we don't have that, we're not going to take the opportunity which exists to make things better and fully realise the advances that science and technology offer to improve care, particularly for children. So tonight we're going to be considering the question of when should we be taking a second look at a child's medical test results, and when and how should we be recontacting families in light of what we learn. When a child receives medical care, any tests done are obviously primarily for the purpose of diagnosing and treating the condition for which the child has presented at hospital or GP. But we know that a test result can sometimes reveal incidental or additional unexpected information. Sometimes this is obvious at the time, such as when somebody's looking at an X-ray and the X-ray reveals something that they weren't necessarily looking for. But sometimes it involves going back and looking at a previous test result and reanalysing it and reconsidering in the light of new medical knowledge. As health records are increasingly digitised and increasingly stored for longer and accessible by health professionals and others beyond the immediate treating clinicians, those possibilities of further analysis are extending considerably and quite possibly inexorably. So it is important we consider this question of when should we be looking at those test results again to identify previously undiagnosed conditions or offer new clinically actionable findings. Indeed, are there circumstances in which it's not only permissible, but it's actually legally or ethically required to revisit and reanalyse those test results? How should recontact be made? And how should that vary depending upon different factors, such as the length of time that has passed, the age of the child at the time of testing or now, the significance of the results for others? How do we ensure appropriate respect for parental views and their values on and preferences with regards to whether analysis takes place and how recontact is to be made? These are obviously just some of the questions which it is important that we work toward answers for. We don't realistically expect to have answers to every one of these questions tonight, but the Collaborative has always had the ambition to contribute to dialogue through more than a single evening. We've come together because we recognise there to be both an urgent need and here an opportunity to both synthesise and generalise learning and experience across different areas of medical practice, to inform an understanding of when it is expected and appropriate for health records to be reanalysed and families recontacted. Now, in order to support meeting that need and to help realising that opportunity, we're going to be using the Collaborative platform to set the intellectual agenda for further work following this evening's meeting. So this evening is about trying to identify the questions that we think need to be answered, the issues and the concerns which need to be addressed. We're then going to carry out a piece of work between now and another meeting next year, where we can begin to identify some potential alternative responses and positions in relation to those issues, concerns and questions. There will then be another event next year where we can come together again to begin to check and challenge the sense of those positions. So the ultimate aim through this work is to elevate a shared understanding of good practice and to support those who are faced with the decision of whether to reanalyse and recontact in a range of different clinical and research settings. So I invite you not only to participate fully tonight, but also to come back next year to further progress some thoughtful responses to the issues and concerns which we raised today. So, helping us to chart or map those difficult issues and to chart a course forward, we've got some wonderful speakers, and let me now turn to them. I'm going to introduce each before they speak, and we'll be starting with a great friend and colleague, very recently promoted to the position of Principal Research Fellow, Dr. Dania Veers. So, Dania is currently a Senior Research Fellow and Team Leader at the Biomedical Health Research Group, Murdoch Children's Research Institute, a social scientist with a genetic counselling background who uses both empirical and theoretical methodologies to explore the practical, social and ethical issues relating to the use of genomics in both clinical and research settings. And Daniel's going to start us off by helping us to understand just what we mean when we talk about reanalysis, both in a genomic and non-genomic testing context, and why reanalysis and recontact raises such challenging ethical and legal issues. Over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Very pleased to be here tonight. Thanks all for coming. As Mark said, I'm going to talk about reanalysis just in the context of genomics as a technology, and then we're going to have Kathy talk about that in non-genomic settings. So, what do we mean when we talk about genomic sequencing? Well, we all have DNA, and that contains the instructions that tell our bodies how to grow and develop. Each person has a unique DNA sequence, and it affects many things about them, including their eye colour and hair colour. And it also might affect their chance of developing some diseases. So DNA is made up of a sequence of letters, and that's A's, T's, C's and G's. And genomic sequencing is a technique that we use to read those letters in a person's DNA. So it finds the orders of a person's letters of the DNA, one by one, and that sequence is what we refer to as genomic data. There are lots of letters to be read, and that means that we have a lot of sequence data to sort through. And once we have that DNA sequence, doctors and scientists can help identify the cause of genetic diseases in patients. With the genomic sequencing, we can read many genes at the same time, which means that it's really helpful in terms of trying to look at people's diseases. And in the past, we could only look at one gene one by one. So it's a lot faster to do it these days. And doctors and scientists look for changes in the DNA that we call variants. And they're the things that are different between people who have diseases and those who are healthy. And those changes might be small, like little spelling mistakes, or they might be much bigger, like larger runs of letters that are missing. So as I mentioned, there are lots of benefits of genomic sequencing. So we can do it's a lot faster and a lot cheaper. We can look at lots more genes at the same time. That increases the chance of diagnosis in patients. It also reduces the time to diagnosis, and it also means that we don't have to do as many invasive technologies, such as like muscle biopsies in young children. But there are some issues that we find with genomic sequencing, and that is that there is a lot of data that needs to be sifted through. And that becomes very resource intensive. So we need laboratory scientists to do a lot of the work. And it also means that we sometimes identify variants that we don't know the cause, what they mean. So we might not have enough evidence to say whether they're pathogenic or not pathogenic, meaning that they either cause a condition or they don't. So they're sort of left in limbo. And we also mean that alongside with that, we know that a lot of patients don't actually get a diagnosis from genomic sequencing. So let's talk about what reanalysis is. Reanalysis just basically means taking another look at the existing genomic data. That might mean looking at the entire genomic sequence again, so all that person's DNA, but most of the time it just involves re-looking at any of those variants that we might find that looks suspicious. And we know that if we re-look at people's DNA after about 2 years of time, of those unsolved cases, we usually find about 10 to 15% of new cases that get a diagnosis. So that's pretty impressive. And that's because we have new knowledge and new analysis methods. And there are a lot of statements that have been issued internationally that say that we should be doing this every 2 years. But we don't do it a lot of the time, and we certainly don't do it routinely. There are certain situations where a patient might come in and have reanalysis done because they have an appointment that's triggered a reanalysis. Sometimes they might get a re-referral from a specialist to a genetic centre, and they might get reanalysis done that way. Or they might come in for new treatments, and that might mean that they have a reassessment done. But most of the time, patients don't get reanalysis performed because they're not actually in those situations. So that means there are a lot of patients that miss out. And we know that in Australia from 2018 to 2021, there are about 25,000 patients that had a genomic test, and of those about 17,000 were undiagnosed. That means that there's only about, so that's like less than about half more than half that don't have a diagnosis. And we do have reanalysis done on some of those patients, but that's only about 5% of the patients that have been reanalysed so far. And we know that that's not good enough because it would take us 85 years if we did this way to get a diagnosis of that patient. So we know that we can't do it manually because we just don't have enough resources. But if we did automation in terms of trying to get AI, artificial intelligence, to help us, that might help us with the process and we could get more diagnoses. So I was involved in a project that was awarded some funding, and you can see bioethics is the very small section at the bottom, but an important component. And within that project, they're broadly trying to implement a pathway, a bioinformatics pathway, to do reanalysis in an automated fashion. And so with the ethics stream, we were trying to find out what patients and their families think about these issues of reanalysis. So we tried to recruit patients through Facebook ads, and that worked really well. We got quite a large group of participants. We screened for eligibility and diversity, and then I showed them a video on automated reanalysis. And if you're not sick of my voice by the end of this session, you're welcome to go to that link and hear me again. We also used a program called Mentimeter, which was getting people to rank the characteristics they thought were important about automated reanalysis. So we showed them a pipeline like this, and we said, so in this situation, you would start with all the unsolved patients. There would be steps that might either trigger the reanalysis, or that might be that it's done in a routine fashion, so it's ticking along in the background. We need to think about whether we need to reconsent those patients because they haven't necessarily been told that this is going to happen in an automated fashion. The reanalysis would happen, and then we think about how do we get results back to the clinicians, and then how do those get back to the patients. So we showed them this pipeline and we said, what do you think about this? And asked them lots of questions and had a lot of discussion about it. So we actually managed to recruit 23 participants, and for those who aren't involved in qualitative research, that's not a bad sample size. And you can see that we had a mean age of about 46 years. We had representation from 4 different states. We had some people from rural as well as metropolitan areas. The majority of participants were actually patients or guardians of patients, parents or guardians of patients, but we had some patients themselves. And then we had, unfortunately, not many people who had a lot of diversity in terms of their ethnic background. But we did get some men, which is always important in these studies. So I just want to give you some highlights of what we found. So overall, people were very positive about reanalysis, but they said that it's really important to allow patients an opportunity to opt out of reanalysis. So we need to tell them that it's happening. So as this participant said, I just think that for some people it could be triggering. It could be, I just need to live my life and just get on with it. So if they have the option to say, I just want to not undergo any more testing, I think you've got to give people a choice. They also thought that it was really important to ensure that all families can access reanalysis and not just the wealthy. So we need to make sure that this is something that is publicly funded. So as this participant said, it's good in theory, but again, it takes it back to there are lots of people who won't be able to afford to pay for reanalysis. even as much as they want to. So yeah, that's difficult. It's great to have it as an option for a lot of people, but I think for those that wouldn't be able to access it, then there's cutting out a large proportion of those who might need it the most. We talked a lot about how it would work, and as I mentioned before, we sort of posed that it could happen in like a triggered fashion, where it was happening just in response to certain conditions or something like that, but they generally preferred that it should be continuous, that's happening all the time in the background. So as this person said, and I think geneticists as well probably aren't the most accessible people in the hospital to access. So I think having it run in the background would just eliminate the responsibility on the caregiver to constantly seek an update and push for something to be retested. And then finally, we talked a little bit about prioritising different patients, and we sort of talked about whether that was necessary or not, but if we did need to prioritise patients, they definitely felt that those who were more severe or had more acute conditions should be prioritised. So as this person said, my priority would be for those people who have a condition that is really impinging on their quality of life, and if the genetic testing is going to provide them with an answer, then that can be directed at a remedy, or whether it's potentially a cure, or at least treat the symptoms or treat the disease that's going to impact their day-to-day life. So that's just a snapshot of some of the perspectives that some of the patients had, which I think is something that Heather's going to pick up on a lot more in her presentation. So thank you for listening, and just wanted to acknowledge the other people who have been involved in that study.
So next we have Associate Professor Catherine Quinlan. Cathy Quinlan is a paediatric nephrologist, clinical scientist, principal fellow and academic lead for graduate research at the Royal Children's Hospital, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and the University of Melbourne. Has a career focus on genetic kidney disease and a passion for the early detection of disease to prevent progression. As a health services researcher, Cathy's work centres on the interface between nephrology, genomics, educational research and implementation science. And Cathy, I think you're going to talk to us about a practical example of where reanalysis and recontact has taken place, and let us know more about your experience.
Perfect. Now, I don't have any slides, so you're going to have to look at that picture or get rid of that picture. So about 6 years ago, I met a man who, for the sake of this evening, we'll call Mark, in my clinic, along with his 3 children. And by the time our clinical consultation was over, I had diagnosed Mark and all 3 kids with a condition called Alport syndrome, which is a degenerative genetic kidney disease that starts seemingly innocently with microscopic amounts of blood in the urine and ends in kidney failure. Now, Mark had been known to our hospital, I work at RCH, to have microscopic hematuria, or microscopic amounts of blood in his urine, from the age of 3. But he wasn't actually met by a nephrologist until the day he came into the emergency department in kidney failure, when it was too late to offer him anything but dialysis and a planned transplant. Throughout his entire childhood, his phenotype, or his description, his disease, everything that should have told us this, was sitting in our paper charts, and nobody knew that they needed to look for it. And Mark's obvious question in clinic was, why the hell did nobody tell me about this? Surely if it's sitting in your records, somebody could have warned me about this. Somebody could have told me that this was going to happen. And somebody could have warned him for his children. Because what was particularly difficult, as I diagnosed his kids, was that I was able to explain that because we were diagnosing them so young, we could start them on a well-tolerated, very old-fashioned medicine that's been around for years. You take it once a day, and it delays the onset of kidney failure by an average of 20 years. So while Mark was delighted to hear that for his kids, you could see the numbers kind of going in his head, and he was like, not only have I had 3 children with this same condition, but I'm also now hearing that if you guys had picked this up earlier, I could have had a completely different adolescence and a completely different time as a 20 and 30-year-old. It seemed pretty reasonable to me that we should have been able to figure this out, but I just didn't know how we would go about it. But the following year, RCH moved to an electronic medical record. We were the first hospital in Australia to move to a medical record called EPIC. And every day in every hospital, when patients or healthcare workers or lab staff interact with our healthcare record, we leave little breadcrumbs, thousands of tiny little data points. And as the years go by, those data points start to tell stories about our patients and their families. They tell us potentially where we need to be looking for what is the cause of their condition and how we can treat them and how we can improve their outcomes. But when we had isolated paper charts, we had no way to look across all of the records and try to find the signal in the noise. And to try and address that, I began a project a couple of years ago with the Centre for Health Analytics, which is a group in Melbourne Children's that sits between the University of Melbourne, RCH and MCRI, that aims to try and use the data in the electronic medical record to improve healthcare outcomes for kids, right, which seemed kind of tailor-made for the project that I wanted to do. And so I wanted to find out if I could identify all of the children in the hospital who'd ever had microscopic hematuria that had not been followed up. Now we have, guidelines about how these kids should be followed up. Guidelines are only guidelines. They don't always get followed. So I interrogated the system and I found several thousand children who had not been followed up. And I went, oh, this seemed like a good idea. Several thousand children, what am I supposed to do about that? And then I stratified them based on risk. And I eventually identified 1,300 kids who I now felt were at risk of Alport syndrome. At risk in a way that I couldn't define because nobody had done the population level data before, but I felt I had this duty of care to do something about this. Now I will stop to say that this study was designed with a large consultation group that included patients and included families of patients who'd been impacted by kidney disease. And so we tried to design it in a way that would include the lived experience of families from the word go. And then we decided we better start contacting people and invite them into the hospital. What we would do is we would ask them to repeat this urine sample, and if the blood was still there, then we would see them face to face, offer them a genomic test, and a genomic test in our service is a saliva swab from inside your mouth, send it off to the lab, and it has a really high sensitivity for picking up Alport syndrome. Then anybody who had Alport syndrome could be recruited into our kidney team, followed up, started on medications, whatever it was that they needed. We've been running the service for about 18 months now, and we've picked up 4 kids with Alport syndrome so far, along with multiple family members. So in theory, in terms of proving our ability to use data to find children at risk of disease and improve their outcomes, we've done it. But the reason that I'm up here today is because the hard part of this project, when I started off, I thought was going to be the data. I thought it was going to be looking in all those records, designing my search inquiries, figuring out how to stratify things. But actually, the really hard part is how do you contact 1,300 families? How do you say to them, hi, you've never met me before, you've never been seen by a kidney doctor before. You may have only ever come to our hospital once, maybe because you had a fever once. Someone sent a urine sample, and at the time we didn't realise its significance. Now we do, and we think there's a chance your child might have a significant condition, and we'd like to invite you for retesting. Nobody wants to be phoned with that message when they're in Coles on a Thursday evening. People don't overly open their post, as we discovered as we started sending out letters. Most text messages just look like spam, and we don't collect patients' email addresses. So the actual how of contacting people became a huge barrier to us. And then deciding what we would actually say when we contacted them became another huge barrier. We knew that we needed, once we contacted them, we needed to be able to respond to them quickly, and we needed to be able to see them quickly. You can't leave people with that hanging over their head. But there was a lot of logistics to that. How do you word these letters? So obviously what we did was we sat down with patients and families of all different levels of education and healthcare literacy and different languages, and talked about the different language that we could use in contacting people. Because these are not patients like Dania is speaking to. These are not families who have had a genetic test done and are now being contacted with a reanalysed result. These are people who have never been our patients, and arguably, do I have the right to be looking in their healthcare record in the first place? Now I have the information, I have to do something about it. So we found out all sorts of interesting things, like if I said hematuria, which is the medical term for blood in your urine, if I said hematuria in a letter, what does everybody do when they see hematuria? Like if you got a letter and it said, you've got hematuria, what would you do? Google it, right. So if you Google hematuria, it says bladder cancer. First up, front line. Your child's got bladder cancer. Now, the child does not have bladder cancer. By and large, kids don't get bladder cancer, by and large. So we couldn't say hematuria. If you say blood in the urine, pretty much shows up the same thing. I'm not even slightly concerned that these patients have cancer, but immediately they're all going to think that. But we found out that for some reason, red blood cells in the urine worked well, provided after urine we wrote "we" in brackets. Can't just write "we," that doesn't sound serious enough. Got to write urine, but then write "we" in brackets. We also found that putting a QR code to a movie that was just me saying in a very reassuring tone of voice, which, same as Danya, if not sick of my voice, you can find that on YouTube, explaining all of this to you. And we got patients and families to talk about what Alport syndrome had meant to them and why an early diagnosis was so good to them. So we had to do this enormous amount of work to actually figure out, when we contacted people, how did we concern them enough that they would contact us, but not so much that they would lose their minds in the meantime. We had to then be able to respond quickly to them and see them in our service quite quickly, which means we needed a dedicated helpline and a dedicated email address to deal with all the inquiries. And thankfully I had a PhD student who is just a really complex care paediatrician who's really good at dealing with families, and so was really well able to deal with anybody who phoned in. But without that, I think we would have really struggled to actually look after people well. So we had a problem with the how do we contact families? And then we had a problem with the what do we say when we contact families? And then we also had, and that's part of why I'm really interested to have this conversation this evening, we had on a broader hospital level, I mean, this was a project that went through ethics and got, went through all the proper governance steps and all that stuff. But when it suddenly started happening and families started ringing in, the questions about whether we had opened up our hospital to reputational risk and whether there could be legal implications to diagnosing somebody with a significant condition 5 years after the fact, whether or not that was something we should have been more mindful of. Now, I think once you've opened the can of worms, you've opened the can of worms. And from a duty of care point of view, I was very comfortable with the fact that I needed to contact people. I also knew that once you're diagnosed with this condition sort of within 5 or 10 years of, by the age of 10 or 12, you're probably fine. So I wasn't particularly worried that I was going to have a significant problem on my hands. But that was a significant concern that came up. And I'm sure that it comes up, and I know that it comes up in the reanalysis pipeline as well, because you can have the situation where somebody has had another child with that condition who's not been diagnosed, or where perhaps somebody could have started some preventative therapy if that reanalysis had been triggered 6 months previous or something similar. So these sort of legal implications really they make us all rather nervous, but it isn't a reason to not do it, I don't feel, but I do feel we need proper regulation and frameworks around us to allow us to provide better care to patients and to allow us to be able to look into this data and do it in a good way. And so what I hope we've achieved through our project is we have found a way to use data, because our project has been designed not just for patients with kidney disease, but as a trail of breadcrumbs for the next group who want to do proactive healthcare. And I hope that we have managed to put all those bits in place, but we still have not sorted out the legal and the regulatory side of it. So which is what I'm kind of hoping we might start the steps towards today. Because I do feel that my job as a paediatrician, which used to be about treating children when they were sick, can actually completely morph into just looking after children and keeping them well so that they never get sick and so that they never have to come into hospital, and that we can keep them as well as possible at home, rather than just looking after them when they are really acutely unwell. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Well, clearly there was a lot of work that went into that project with regard to co-design materials with patients and families. One of the questions I think we're going to have to address is how much does that work need to be done each and every time, and to what extent can we begin to generalise certain principles and give guidance to others that perhaps has engagement with families and patients, but not necessarily to the same degree with the same resource implications for every single time, if we want to make this standard practice. Which is why I think the patient and the perspective is clearly going to be so important. So next up we have Heather Renton. Heather is the founder and former CEO of Syndromes Without a Name, Swan Australia, which is a support group that provides information, connection, support and advocacy to families caring for a child with an undiagnosed or rare genetic condition. Heather herself is the mother of 2 neurodiverse children, one of whom has a rare genetic condition called FOXP1 syndrome. Heather is a consumer representative on a number of different advisory groups and committees, and a passionate disability and health advocate, particularly around genomic technology and co-design. So very much looking forward to hearing your views, Heather. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So there's a number of things to consider when we're talking about putting a framework or best practice guidelines together when we're looking about recontacting patients and reanalysis. So the first thing is consent. And are we talking dynamic consent, broad consent, specific consent? And what happens when your child transitions to a different hospital and they're over 18? My daughter's got an intellectual disability. She is capable of making some decisions, supported decisions, but it needs to be broken down. And we don't have consent forms in Easy English, which are aimed at a 5-year-old literacy level. We don't have them in Easy Read, aimed at a 10-year-old literacy level. And genomics is knocking on our door, so we've got work to do. And so many people, I would imagine, would just sign that consent form because they're desperate for an answer. I know I was. So we really need to look at consent, make sure it's well explained to patients and their families, and we've got to outline the purpose, the benefits and the risks associated with the tests we're doing. And then the next thing to consider is communication. How are we going to do this? And I think we need to do it in at least 2 different ways. People move addresses, houses, they forget to update their address. Not everyone's email savvy, and it was mentioned before, SMSs, they go into spam. So we've got to have a bit of some options. So I think 2 ways is good. How frequently? Every 2 years. And I know a geneticist might say, well, if the family wants to know, they can contact me in 2 years' time. Well, because technology gets better. But parents are busy and 2 years can go like this. We've got automated systems. Why aren't we using them? And patients and their families deal with a lot. It's overwhelming, and we forget. 2 years will go by, and it shouldn't be all on us. It should be both. And if symptoms develop, then sure, patients can contact their clinicians. And we've got e-health records, but I found out today only 11% of families use the e-health records at the Children's Hospital. I love it. But in Australia, we've got 2 children's hospitals that use it and not a big take-up. So we need to change that as well. And I think when we're talking communication, we have to talk about respect, trust and transparency. They've got to be the 3 key things. And then the next thing to consider are the practical aspects. We need to prioritise the when, the who, the how. Otherwise, we won't have a workforce who'll be able to do the work, and it's going to become expensive. So do we prioritise the care in patients from their perspective, or do we consider the purpose, the risks, the benefits to the patients who only want to know if there's an affordable treatment for them? And then we talk about patients and family engagement and empowerment. Now, I have a Google alert on my phone, so whenever there's a new paper published on FOXP1, I have a read and then I email it off to my daughter's geneticist. I'm probably extreme, but he doesn't have time to research this condition. And there was something in one of the research papers that said we recommend all kids with FOXP1 have a renal ultrasound. Now that would help Kathy if she saw a FOXP1 patient, maybe diagnose another FOXP1 patient. You just don't know what chats go on in the corridor at RCH. So I think the more you know, the more, as a parent and a passionate advocate, I want to do what I can to educate the health system about the condition. But we've also got to remember, not everyone wants an answer. That's okay. Some parents will say, well, I've lived with my child for 20 years. Nothing's going to change if I have an answer. For me, I want to know what the future holds. So I was desperate to find an answer. It did take us 9 years and 2 misdiagnoses, but we got there in the end. But it's about that respect, and just because a clinician really wants an answer for a family, it doesn't mean a family member does. And the other thing to consider is patients might not want their data reanalysed because they might fear it will impact their clinical care, or they might go, well, I better go and get it reanalysed because otherwise I might not get the treatment and the care that I deserve. And then data, security, privacy, everything seems to get hacked these days. So that can put patients and their families off looking for reanalysis. And the duty to disclose to family members, you know, if you do find an answer. Trust reanalysis, you know, sometimes you get it wrong, and that's really hard. I know we had 2 diagnoses, both life-limiting, retracted, and that sense of being overwhelmed and the emotions, no parent wants to go through that. So, and privacy laws continue to change, so it's about keeping up to date with those as well, and always think when you're looking at data, is it in the most secure way? We know with rare disease, sometimes you can still pick the cases. And then we've mentioned equity and clinical care. You know, is it the squeaky wheel, the person who jumps the highest, who gets that test when we're workforce poor? Or is it the sickest patient? Or is it the person who's proactive or has a good relationship with their doctor? And what about patients who live in rural and regional areas and diverse populations? Do they get left behind? So we've got to consider all these things. And then the mental health and emotional well-being of patients and their family. Probably there'd be many, many carers, parents out there who have post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of caring for their child. Every day is a struggle for so many of these families. It can be overwhelming. It takes time to process when you get a diagnosis. It can trigger different emotions. And just because a parent holds it together and said, yep, no, I want this reanalysis, the world can come crashing down. They might hold it together in the appointment, but they walk out of the room and they'll spend an hour crying in the car. Or 2 weeks later, no one's followed up to see if they haven't jumped off the Westgate Bridge. Or when symptoms develop 6 months later. It can be really tough, and I think that's where a good relationship with the clinician, the respect, the transparency, good open lines of communication can really help. And I think clinicians are often best placed to judge, do we think this family can cope with finding an answer? And then lab reports. Every lab report we got said this family would benefit from genetic counselling. I have never seen a genetic counsellor for my daughter. So don't put things in reports, don't say things if you can't deliver on them because you let patients down. Refer on to peer support groups when you can, share that knowledge, give them empowerment so they can make informed decisions. And ethics. Think socially, ethically, considering if the benefits will outweigh the risks. I'm sure clinicians do this every day. We've got an ethical duty to keep improving diagnosis and treatments and foster healthy lives. It's a human right to know about your disease if you can, I think. And then what about the overarching presence of a framework, best practice guidelines? I think we need them to help make decisions as to when, for who, the frequency, and how reanalysis should be done. There needs to be patient-centred and co-designed at every step, not just at the beginning. And we've still got a lot of educating to do around co-design because people think sometimes that signing off on a letter of support or running a, you know, setting up a community advisory group, but you've got to tune in with them at every stage of the project, not just come and go, what do you think of this? That's not co-design. So, patients, families, researchers, clinicians, policymakers all have to work together on these best practice guidelines or framework with good governance. And then we've got to review and evaluate the guidelines. Things will evolve and processes will become more streamlined, so we've got to keep updating. Ethical standards, logistics and legal requirements may change. We need to be adaptive to advancing technologies, including AI. And decisions need to be respected, transparent and always with the patient's best interest in mind, and made ethically considering the emotional and social well-being of the patient as well as their physical health. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Heather. It's great to hear that you're supportive of the idea that we might develop some kind of good practice framework and guidelines. I mean, clearly respect, trust and transparency are going to be crucial to anything which we do. I just note that the relationship between the clinicians seems so important, and the example that Kathy gave is when you actually don't have that relationship and you're reaching into records for people that were seen by other clinicians. How are we going to manage that, and how are we going to manage that when we know that the organisation themselves is going to see some reputational risk if there isn't that relationship and you don't know how the patients are going to react. So next we have Rachel Haverfield to talk to us from the perspective of the legal perspective and address some of the issues that Kathy's mentioned in relation to reputational legal risk. Rachel's an international lawyer who spent many years abroad working with major law firms and public and private companies in technology and life science sectors, including genomics. Recently returned to Australia, Rachel's taken on the role of General Counsel at Murdoch Children's Research Institute. A keen interest in the use of genomic and other technologies in healthcare, particularly the opportunities and ethical and privacy challenges these bleeding edge technologies bring with them. Over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Hello everybody, I'm really pleased to be invited and involved with this incredible panel that we have here. But because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to premise it with a disclaimer. My background's commercial and I've worked in various technologies, as Mark said, with a bent on genomics and next-gen sequencing, lab services as well. So I may inadvertently refer to patients as customers, I apologise in advance. And I'm not a medico-legal expert, so I can only speak to what I know about this, not the state of the art in claims or case law. I've also spent many years overseas, so I may mix up my jurisdiction. So feel free to pull apart what I say. I have no pride of ownership on what I currently am saying right now. So as we all know, and as Dania alluded to, there's been a paradigm shift in the last few years from targeted specific testing for a specific thing at a specific point in time to a much broader based, for example, multi-gene panel tests or whole exome, whole genome sequencing. I'm going to talk a lot about genomic data because that's my background. Genomic data has the potential to offer diagnostic, predictive and susceptibility information now and in the future. Now, the issues with genomic data is that the risk of unsolicited findings is high. Sometimes there'll be a drug or an intervention, sometimes there won't be, or most times there won't be. Some people want to know, and sometimes knowing can actually cause more harm to the patient than not. It also has, as alluded to, there has the added complexity of having relevance beyond the patient to family members as well. So, while the clearest way forward for clinicians is to have the binding guidelines that Mark has been talking about, I think it's going to be extremely hard to legislate for that and get broad agreement across the various sectors, types of medicine, and the various specialisms to get there. It's also the perverse nature, and I apologise to my litigative colleagues, the perverse nature of the adversarial system is that I'm looking for problems and telling you what not to do when a clinician's interest is just the best interest of the patient. It's as simple as that. They want the best outcome for the patient and will bend over backwards to get there. And what I'm going to say and what the hospital has said to Kathy is that please don't do that because that exposes us to risk. Now, whether that is a real risk or not is something that's almost irrelevant in the medical space because the vast majority of medico-legal litigation is settled, and it could be an entirely spurious claim, and MCRI get tons of them, but not claims, but we get subpoenas to provide information. But the answer is the cost of response, the cost of barristers, the cost of solicitors, the time to the management team, the time to the scientists, the time to the clinicians to support a litigation, it's just not worth it. So often they'll settle even though the answer was in favour of the organisation. So looking at the duty of care, and I know that Kathy talks about the duty of care, there is currently no legal duty of care to recontact. Well, I'm not aware of any case law on the topic anyway. There is a lot of case law, and a lot of the negligence case law out there is around a clinician's responsibility to follow up, and which largely centres on providing clinically significant results of tests ordered be communicated. That's not directly on point, but those would guide what we should be considering when we're talking about a duty of care in the context of the obligation or recontact. So to bring a successful claim, there's significant hurdles for a plaintiff patient to overcome, which I think in the RCH context would just not have seen the light of day. So they have to show there's a duty of care owed to them to be recontacted. They would have to show there's a breach of that duty of care owed. Then they would also have to show that they suffered damage as a result of the failure to contact, which in follow-up cases means that the patient would need to demonstrate that the reanalysis, the new technology, the test, the intervention is demonstrably better than the then current standard of care at the time of the original testing, and that if they had been recontacted and taken the test, treatment, etc., that this would have altered the outcome. So this is a significant barrier to entry, but as I mentioned, it's almost irrelevant because they just won't even want to get to the point of the court. So in the duty of care, from a duty of care perspective, considerations that a court might look at to establish failure of a duty of care is the currency of the doctor-patient relationship that Mark mentioned earlier. Is this still a current patient of the clinician? If not, how long ago were they a patient? If it was 10 years ago, this would simply not be reasonable that the clinician might want to follow up, although Kathy, again, your cohort was years out. If it was 6 months ago, obviously this would be within range. But then query this in the context of a medical lab, for example, that retains the raw data basically forever and has the ability to automatically reanalyse it. What would be reasonable there? The severity of the condition, how serious the condition is, how likely is the new treatment, diagnosis, technology, intervention likely to affect the patient's health outcomes. So if, for example, the gene points to increased susceptibility to eczema versus you are going to get bladder cancer. You know, these are things that a court would look at. Now, if we find out in the future that eczema is an indicator of something else, more pathogenic, again, that, you know, these, as I say, these things are very, very contextualised. The actionability of the results. So how effective is the new treatment, diagnosis and intervention to treat the condition? And it takes a very, very long time for new technologies to become standard of care. So that is something a court, again, would look at. But if you, to Kathy's point, if you scratch any clinician, they're going to say that they're ethically obliged to contact a patient who is in harm's way or who may be in harm's way. But the ethical considerations have also been used to support both justification for and against. So to Heather's example, for example, how will the duty of recontact be reconciled with the patient's fundamental right of autonomous decision-making to not know? And consider the difference here with a couple using genetics for reproductive decision-making, which is a short targeted period of their life and a decision is made or a decision is not made to have a baby, to terminate a pregnancy, etc., versus a rare disease family seeking answers. So in discussions I've had with clinical geneticists in this issue, their view of their patient set is that even if a rare disease child has died, they would still go to the family with the new information just to end the diagnostic odyssey. It doesn't even matter that the patient has passed away. They think it would be their ethical responsibility to go and recontact that family. So context here is extremely relevant. From a legal perspective, the informed consent is hugely relevant. So clinicians should be ensuring that they operate within the parameters of what has been consented to. To Heather's point, that is a very legal document often. Then they are done so to be litigation proof because all of those words have been tried and tested in case law. So that is, you know, what you see is an output from a legal process, effectively. But an individual's expectation of data use and return must be clearly set from the outset. There should be no surprises from the end user. I note that in talking to my lab services colleague at MCRI, that the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, so the National Pathology Accreditation Advisory Council for Medical Testing for Human Genetic Variation, this is part of the lab accreditation to provide clinical genetic tests, has set out some very, very clear requirements for what an informed consent looks like in a genetic test, and it's structured in the severity of the condition. So level 1 is basic conditions. Level 3 is highly likely to die scenarios. So that's a very poor way of framing it, but those are effectively what it is. And in that, they are now suggesting that recontact is embedded in the informed consent, as well as how it gets shared with research as well. So there's very clear parameters in those guidelines now. I think from a privacy perspective, that the knowns there are exactly as Heather suggested. There's obviously known misuse of genetic data. There is a lot of cybercrime. Nothing is safe I used to work in cybersecurity, and it literally nothing is safe. You cannot completely de-identify genetic data. It is always, there's a recent study in the US where they were able, from genomic data that's in the public domain, so on the internet, they could recreate a surname. So on the basis of just stuff you find on the World Wide Web, you could get to a surname. Now that is specific cohorts. Daniel's looking at me going, what are you talking about? But this is specific sort of, white Anglo-Saxon males in America. So, these are people who have their data out there. It's not everybody, but, it is not impossible to re-identify genetic data. In the rare disease context as well, you have phenotypic indicators which are, obvious because there's not very many people. So from a privacy perspective, we really need to be careful as well. Practical considerations. I know this is not legal, but the practical part of coming up with guidelines to keep... So safety for doctors is really equals clarity, right? So if we have clarity around and what we're talking about, then that's when you can identify when you're within your duty of care or not. But standardisation is going to be extremely hard with this particular set of parameters. There are patient-related factors of patient anxiety, potential medical actionability, implications for the families, test-related items, availability of data on cancer risk, probability of uncertain data, cohort-related issues, and logistical factors. There are some professional guidance out there. So the American College of Medical Genetics issued a policy statement where, on recontact, this is, placing the responsibility of contact on the patients and their primary care physicians, as you mentioned, Heather. Now, is that scalable? No. The European Society of Human Genetics did not suggest a duty to recontact, but indicated that recontact may be required when findings would potentially have a high information value or medical impact. Genomics England, who I worked with very closely, has an unpublished recontact policy where, in order to return findings, that the following should be considered, and that is if there's evidence of symptoms, if the recontact person relates to potential diagnosis, then that is a fine reason to recontact. If the recontact purpose relates to an unexpected finding, there is an exceptions process, an exceptional circumstances process which they follow, which talks about serious risk of harm, clear potential therapeutic benefit, etc. They look at severity of condition, actionability of results, as I mentioned, and importantly, impact on family members. So where the clinical context of the finding significantly affects the individual's family, this should be considered. But just to note, the establishment of recontact practice guidance or position statement may describe a reasonable practice for recontact, but ultimately the court determines legal liability. So clinical practice guidelines may be used as evidence, but they do not define the standard of care. So while it would be useful, it wouldn't be a slam dunk solution. So anyway, this has dipped the toes into some of the legal considerations, although there's a lot of depth to consider in this subject. And at the end of the day, patient care should be at the forefront, not protecting the hospital's butt. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, whilst I think we'd all agree patient care should be at the forefront, we do need to get the organisations on board. So maybe we just need to be able to demonstrate it's riskier for them not to do it than it is for them to do it.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk, guys. Very interesting. So it seems to me there's like kind of two problems here, and one problem's like the problem we face now, which Kathy, I thought, spoke to really well, that you've got people who've come in, they haven't given consent for re-looking at the medical records. There's this, cost benefit thing which you have right now. But then there's the problem, where do we go from now? And it seems like maybe that's easier. Like, is an easy solution when people go in for a medical test, they get asked, do you give permission for this test result to be looked at in the future? Or we can, throw the test result away if you want afterwards. And after you've given consent for that, going forward, then it seems like a lot of ethical issues at least become a bit simpler. Just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that false, easy solution for the future.
I think it depends on what the test is. So if we're talking about a genetic test or genomic test, we can be really, really super clear with families that this is, as I am with all of the families when I order genomic tests, there will be continuous reanalysis. So when I return a negative result, I say, hey guys, just so you know, we continuously look at these results. So we could phone you sometime in the future, any time in the future, to tell you that we have something more to discuss. So I think that's relatively straightforward. They've given consent at the time of test, and when I go back with a negative result, I remind them of that. I also remind them when it's a positive result that we might well look at this again in the future, even though there's no current plans going on about that, because you never know what we might decide to do about secondary findings. What I think is really complex in terms of your overall healthcare and everything that's sitting there in the healthcare record is that none of us thinks, whenever we have a routine test, that anything seriously wrong will ever actually come out of it. So when your child falls and breaks their arm and they have an x-ray done of their arm, we want their arm to be fixed, we want all that to be okay. We're never going to tell them to put it in the bin. But how am I going to feel if someone phones me back 2 years later to say, with improved scanning technologies, we've seen the early signs of condition XYZ, and we'd like to talk to you a bit more about that. I don't know that anybody can adequately give consent for the enormity of what we could find from your entire medical record in the future. I'm gobsmacked by what we could potentially do. I don't know how to explain that to people.
I guess that's right. So you couldn't give consent to all the different types of things that could be found, but most people have like a general idea, oh, well, I want to know if my kid has an actionable medical condition. I don't care exactly what the condition is, but if you're going to have information that I can act on, then I do give consent for whatever you do.
Yeah, so certainly one thing we did, so when we contacted families, is that we didn't badger them. So if you didn't respond to 2 letters, which were heavily embedded with links to movies and blah, 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 like a whole load of extra information, if you didn't respond, you didn't respond. 80% of people didn't respond. So they voted with their feet. Did they just not understand the letter? Do the parents have the right to not respond and their child might be 17 or 18 now? I don't know the answers to those questions, but some people definitely felt that they just didn't want to know. And the letter simply said, we think you need to have a repeat urine sample done because we may have detected a problem.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to that?
I just think that becomes, as you identified, it becomes incredibly complex from a legitimate informed consent perspective to do that. That's where things like dynamic consents do come in, and people are successfully, even MCRI and Australian Genomics are successfully using dynamic consents. But I do believe, if a kid goes in for a broken arm, it's very different than somebody doing the whole genome, for example. So,
do you want to just say what dynamic consent is in case people don't know what that is?
Yeah, so dynamic consent is just a mechanism where consent can be asked for again with respect to a specific context at a specific time. It requires technology to support it, and again, it's not. I think in a lot of countries it hasn't worked particularly well. There are only a couple of examples where dynamic consent has worked particularly effectively. I'm going to say it works really well for Australian Genomics because I was told to say no. They've just actually published a paper on that showing that it has worked really well. But yeah, there are other ways of doing it other than trying to achieve that in the upfront way.
Can I just, I I guess it's more a question. I think we're probably moving towards another 10 years, we'll exome every kid from birth. So what happens then? And this is why it's so important that we need to get best practice guidelines and a framework embedded now, because genomics is moving at a rapid rate and we're trying to catch up.
We are in some ways we're almost already at I mean there's a big project going on about exome first for kids in Adelaide, I want to say, but there is an Australian genomics project, but also with preconception carrier screening. It's now funded by Medicare. I know a lot of people have had the funded one through Mackenzie's mission, and there is privately paid for, but Medicare is now paying for 3 conditions: SMA, Fragile X, and CF, for the last 3 or 4 weeks. That data is there for reanalysis, right? Because that's a broad bit of data that's going to sit there potentially on every couple who thinks they're going to have a baby over the next few years. And I don't know what their consent process is like. But what happens when somebody wants to add on something new? Or they were told they did not have a risk of cystic fibrosis because this particular variant fell below the diagnostic line, and now it doesn't. Now it's fallen above the diagnostic line, so do they want to be recontacted with that after they're already pregnant with the child?
I think one of the values of the framework, if we were to get one, is not only would it help to establish what is standard and good practice for the clinicians and the researchers, but it would help the conversation and an understanding across the community as a whole. So if it just becomes known this is what we do, then we have a more informed conversation just between the patients and the clinicians themselves. Paula.
Thanks. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've been thinking quite a bit about the healthcare system and healthcare costs. And so if we're suddenly picking up on all these conditions, and then there's treatment required, there's maybe long-term care required. So, where do we factor this into decisions about what we're looking for, because of the implications for, in some ways, the economics of the healthcare system?
I might just comment on that to begin with, just because I did some focus groups with clinicians as well as health laboratory scientists as well as the patient group, and that's definitely something that came up quite a lot. I guess the thing to keep in mind is we're not picking up people who weren't going to get sick anyway. We're not telling people that so you might have people who are getting earlier surveillance, but that's likely to help them in terms of their overall outcomes. We're not picking up people who weren't going to get sick, if that makes sense.
It's true, but they may not have had all the types of intervention earlier in their lives. So I suppose I'm just saying, is there proper analysis? Because it might be that picking people up earlier actually does save costs to the healthcare system, but it could be that picking people up earlier actually creates costs for the healthcare system.
We've done some of that work in our group, which is looking at patients with glomerular disease, so things like Alport syndrome, so a particular type of kidney disease, which is responsible for 30% of genetic kidney disease in this country. And we've looked at mapping out their health expenditure, so that the cost of their care and the cost of their lives in the healthcare system, depending on the time point at which they got diagnosed. And overwhelmingly, an early test makes all of their care so much cheaper. Now, the reason for that is that for my patient cohort, dialysis and transplantation is an enormously, enormously expensive intervention. So anything that pushes that out is going to win, because it's $58,000 a year to put somebody on dialysis, and an ACE inhibitor, which is the medication that I use to delay dialysis by 20 years, costs something like $11 a month. Like, it's nothing. It's not even, they're not even in the same aisle in the supermarket. But I think there are questions to be asked about cost, and when we think back to things like preconception carrier screening, we have conditions that we're looking for that we think might be treatable, but some of those treatments are enormously expensive. And so the idea with preconception carrier screening is really to allow people to make those informed decisions before the child is conceived, I'm guessing.
I wonder if Heather wants to speak to the diagnostic odyssey and what the value that might have for patients.
Thanks, Anya. Look, for me, when I got that final diagnosis, it was such a relief, and I didn't know what a weight I was carrying on my shoulders. And just knowing about that condition it kind of normalised it. So, every kid with FOXP1 has difficult behaviour. That's normal. I'm not a crap parent. So I think, you know, there's so much value in knowing, but also when you know, you can connect up with others. So, you know, often the parents are the one educating the specialists and saying, actually, a lot of people have had success with this drug in, you know, treating overactive bladders or whatever it is. Why don't you use that as a first point of call? And it's not written in the research papers yet. So I think it's empowering patients, and it, you know, saves health dollars. So, yeah.
There is a lot of the big cohorts that have been done in the UK. So the UK Biobank, which is 500,000 samples. Our Future Health, which was supposed to be 5 million, they were going to get, I don't know where they've got to with their recruitment. Genomics England had 100,000 genomes. There is health economic data behind that. And just some really, I think, as Heather mentioned, you had 2 misdiagnoses first, which they're treating. So there's a cost to misdiagnosis and mistreatment. But there were also some really interesting examples. So Rady's in the US had come up with a very early test. It was a rapid whole genome sequencing of babies who had some kind of epileptic episode. And they found the treatment for that was very simply vitamin B. So it was a single vitamin B tablet every day, stopped those epileptic episodes before any brain damage had occurred within the first few days of life. And that was it, that was curative. So
that's how it got up in the first place. David Cameron's son passed away.
Yeah, and so this is so there's swings and roundabouts of, there are those children would be on lifelong, well, they have a very diminished life expectancy, but it was a curative thing. Off-the-shelf vitamin B cured those. I can't remember the name of the disorder. You might.
It's often syndrome or something.
Yeah, I can't remember what the name of the syndrome was. But yeah, but there is a lot of health economic data. I don't have it. I read it and went, it's maths. But yeah, there is good data out there on that.
But certainly I've published a couple of papers on others as well, so where we've done good Markov models, where we've modelled out different trajectories of care depending on whether you got a diagnosis or you didn't. Depends on your condition, but for conditions where there is a treatment, oftentimes it is health economically viable to do these tests. And you've got to remember that pediatrics is in a slightly different space now, but originally pediatrics was started because of the fact that there was massive economic benefit to setting kids' arms and giving them vitamin D and looking after them when they were born and they weren't thriving, so that they could grow up and become conscripts in the army, which I think was the original time in the Boer War conscription, when they realised that they were rejecting half of their recruits because of unset arms and rickets. So paediatrics is, generally speaking, a really economically viable area because it takes a very small amount of prevention to save a lot of money over a child's lifetime. I know we're not all about money, but we do have to think those ways sometimes.
I know it's not all about money at all, so I wasn't coming from that perspective that outweighs everything, but more just thinking about how that factors into, I suppose, guidelines or a framework around this. But thank you, that's great.
Hi, I'm not sure who would like to comment on this, but I'm just wondering, to what extent should we just be talking about wellness, and how would that change the way we think about this, whether it's legal or
I can do that.
Or research-based, you know?
So look, I would definitely say that for me, in getting involved in this type of work, I've realised that my real power as a paediatrician is not in treating sick children, even though I do that, and that's what I've done for 20 years, but it's actually in the ability to find children at risk and change their outcomes and keep them so that they're always well and that they're never sick. So I think for me, that's what wellness means. It means a life that's free from the implications of disease. Doesn't mean you don't have whatever the genetic condition is or whatever it is, but that you can live your life without being hampered by it. I mean, maybe that's a bit of a less, I don't know what the standard definition of wellness would be, but that would be mine. And I think that's where we have power in doing this type of thing, is picking up things early, picking up conditions early when we can actually make a difference.
I was also just going to say that I think we need to consider the mental health of these families as well, because that makes a massive difference. And as Heather just alluded to, we know that it makes a huge psychological difference in these families having a diagnosis, and that shouldn't be ignored.
I'll just add to that. I always say there's more to a diagnosis than a name. And, you know, if you have that diagnosis, then you can, you know, you can drive research in the condition. You can find out more, you can help others. And yeah, you're empowered to make informed decisions, but without that diagnosis, it's hard to move forward sometimes.
Thanks for your presentations. That was really interesting. I just wondered if any of the families, and maybe Kathy, this is for you, if any of the families raised the issue of consent of someone trawling through their medical records, maybe sometime after that, presented to the ED with their child fever or virus.
So it's a really good question, and it was of course the really big concern when we did this. Between myself and Grania Butler, who's the PhD student whose PhD is sitting within all of this work, we spoke to 148 families. Nobody complained. Everybody said how amazing it all was, how fantastic it was to think that the hospital actually is looking out for them in so many different ways. Like, we compiled this like massive folder of just beautiful feedback from people, and people weren't upset. A few people were, I'm wrong, we had one conspiracy theory guy who was just off on a whole other plane that I don't think had anything to do with anything, but everybody else was just really positive and felt really looked after. There was a little bit of confusion about why we were contacting them, but having contacted so many, we developed a script pretty quickly. Our secretary had a script for what to say when they phoned in, because it could take me a while to phone them back. And we learned what words and language was best to use. And we developed that with families to start off with, and then kind of refined it over the 148 families that we spoke to. Myself and Grania are both Irish. So what kind of helped was that we both had the same accent. Everybody just assumed they were talking to the nice Irish doctor in the hospital who's looking out for us. And that was one of the comments we got, was that it was good to have an Irish accent talking to you when people are telling you bad things. So we were helpful.
It's actually really, again, back to sort of the legal versus medical position. So we often have these, not arguments, or discussions at Murdoch about informed consent and whether a rare disease patient parent can ever be giving true consent because it's in a situation of duress. And the doctors will look at you and go, you're mad. Like, why do you, of course they want the answer. You're in, why your assessment of risk is idiotic. And then you're like, well, I'll go and find an enforcement action right now. But then you never find. Anyway, so it is that thing where you're, from a legal perspective, your tendency is to try and find the problem, whereas these guys are very much trying to find a solution for the wonderful people they work with.
Can I just pick up on that consent? So we consented. It was described to me as growing cells in a petri dish. And when I speak to a genetic counsellor about something else last year, and she said, well, your daughter's DNA would be buried in the MCRI deep freezer. So I said, well, how do I know that now? This is 16 years on, how do I know? So parents forget, but who's to say that that piece of DNA won't fall into someone else's hand? Parents forget. And it was only when I was investigating, what happened when her data left Australian shores as well. Did that get destroyed? No one can tell me. So there's still a lot of, I guess, things you consent to and then you kind of forget about it until, you might think about out of the blue. So what do we do with that? Just a question.
I don't have the answer to that. But I was just going to say that having looked at a lot of the consent forms, because every state has their own consent form and they all discuss this issue, if at all, slightly differently. And so that's one of the problems we've been facing with this whole reanalysis process, is thinking about what have patients actually given consent to and how much they remember, and then thinking about having to go back and reconsent to 17,000 patients is scary. But I think it's something we need to really consider. There have been studies that have done waivers of consent, looking at trying to just reanalyse without getting consent for the families, and that's apparently worked quite well, but that was in adults, looking at breast cancer testing, and so I think that's a very different scenario from rare disease patients.
I guess I was asking from the point of view of being a secondary purpose and the use and disclosure of information. All of those tricky, complex.
And I think that there was a program to try and synthesise the consent form, wasn't it, across the states, and it just never got through.
I've been working on that.
Yeah.
It's been challenging, to say the least. We have got consent forms now, but not every jurisdiction has agreed to use them because they all have their own specificities. So it is a problem.
So I'm involved in a mainstreaming project where we're pushing specialised, from doing testing within a specialised multidisciplinary kidney genetics clinic. We're supporting all nephrologists across the state to provide genetic testing to their patients, which means that we've had to teach them all how to do consent. And they are all supported by genetic counsellors and a whole suite of decision aids and stuff. But one of the things that's very useful is that each consultant has a little text that goes into all of their letters. It says, these are the things that I have discussed. If you don't understand them, please give me a call back. So by putting that in, I kind of hope they have actually done that. And then there's a QR code that goes to a movie that explains the whole lot all over again. And we say that that is to aid family discussion around this in case you change your mind when you go home, and this is the email address that you can contact us with if you do. Which I'd like to think means that for the next however long, that movie is there, that they can watch, that they can remind themselves of what they did. But we do not have dynamic consent in our service at all. I think it's a lovely idea. I would really not like to have access to something like that, but as I was saying, 11% of people sign up to the portal, so I'm not sure how successful we would be with dynamic consent, even though I love the idea.
Can I just say one thing? The trouble with putting that in a letter, people read that, but often people are so overwhelmed. Like when I always describe the first 5 years of it, raising a child with a chronic illness or disability, as the fog, and you can't think clearly. So if I read that, or if you put it back on the patient to do that, we wouldn't do it because we're too overwhelmed. So yeah, that's one thing to consider. And also, I am concerned that we don't have an equitable consent process. What about people whose English isn't their first language and have intellectual disability? They fall through the gaps.
So from a language perspective, we've translated all of our stuff into the top 20 languages that are used for our CH staff, and then we have availability of translators for anything else. From an intellectual disability perspective, I'm not doing any better on that, except to say that we are providing it in a written form, we're providing it in a movie that's like cartoons and stuff, and then we've also provided it in a paragraph in a letter. I think that's as good as we've done. It sounds really pathetic when I say it out loud. But
It's a start when you're thinking about it. That's a positive.
And we're actually starting to do the same with the national consent form. So we've just started a new working group that I'm very pleased to be part of, where we're trying to develop other materials, so videos and things like that, so that people are supported more. Yeah.
And it's so important to test them too.
Oh, we did that. So the testing of the videos was really strong in the Melbourne Genomics cohorts. We tested our videos across multiple cohorts in Melbourne Genomics, mitochondrial flagship, cardiac, kidney, and a couple of others. And feedback was really good in terms of, and then we went back and iteratively changed the things that we were told needed changing. But in terms of people's comprehension, we did a thing in our project where we, immediately after clinic, after results had been disclosed, we gave people like a test, what do you remember? And then we went back again 3 months later to see what they remembered 3 months later in terms of both the consenting process originally and the results disclosure, to see, and about 89% of people remembered accurately certain questions, like medical student kind of questions. You know, what does a variant mean? What does this answer mean? What does a negative result mean? Things like that. So we have tried to assess our communication process, I think, as good as we can, but definitely we've not done well for people with intellectual disabilities.
I think this will be the last question.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you very much for your presentations and this really interesting discussion. I just have a question, and what do you think, and I'd just like to hear from just one thing from each of the panelists, what do you think that we need to put in place if we want to make this just a routine thing in care? So kind of going back and retesting. What do you think is one thing that, from your perspective, needs to be in place to make that happen?
Okay, so other people are going to say things about genetics and genomics and consent, so I'm going to go with contact. I think we need to have the patient portal, which is the patient-facing bit of our electronic medical record that gives all patients the same access to everything that's in the system as we have, or at least it's supposed to. I think that needs to be given to everybody as standard. It shouldn't be something that they have to go off and sign up to, and notifications need to be turned on as standard with it. Facebook does this stuff, like you can't get rid of that off your phone. I don't see why we can't have this done better. 11% of people sign up for the portal on average at RCH, and yet it is our best way of communicating, sending messages, updating things. It's where dynamic consent could happily, easily sit, particularly for families who have more complex healthcare needs and interact with our hospital more often. They are our biggest portal users, but I think we need to have it as standard for everyone. And I would urge any hospital who's getting Epic in to just switch it on day one for everybody.
I mean, consent obviously is really critical, but I also think that we need to develop better follow-up processes as well. So we need to make sure that all these new diagnoses we're finding, we have the resources in place to take care of them afterwards and put them in touch with the support groups and give them genetic counselling. That's all really critical too.
This is probably a little bit undereducated position from me, but the GDPR has a very good research exemption. So that allows the secondary use for research purposes, and it's quite broad and it's very well defined. I think that I don't know how well defined it is here, if at all. My understanding is it's not particularly well defined, but yet a research exemption that would allow secondary use to do reanalysis, recontact would be helpful. I think obviously this is a clinical application, so it doesn't quite get to where we need to be for recontact. And to Mark's point, a set of a framework of guidelines, a better description for clinicians to safely approach this.
I'm sort of agreeing with Kathy, but not everyone has a smartphone, so you do leave people behind. But I think it should be an automated system. Every 2 years, we'll give people the option, by 2 different methods as a bit of a safeguard, and to say, would you just ask the question, would you be happy for us to keep, if the opportunity arose, relook at your data? But I'm wondering whether we need to take it a step further and say data in clinical setting or research setting, because we didn't actually define that either.
Bringing the formal part of the proceedings to a close, can I just ask you please to thank the panel for what's been an absolutely fantastic presentation. And thank you all for coming, and please look out for future collaborative events, and indeed the event which we'll be running next year as a follow-up to this. So thank you all, and have a safe journey home. Thank you.